sense for them to work together because they have strengths and weaknesses, but most of the time they're in conflict. And why are they in conflict? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and we're going to go over each one of them, but this is a really big difference, is that they have a different theory of change. So the structure tradition, in the explicit way it's sort of taught in the Linskyite tradition, the goal is to create enough leverage through the structure to force a target to give you a measurable change. And these a lot of times are called instrumental demands, okay? And that's what they focus on. That's how they think about victory. While in Occupy or in the global justice movement, they were really shifting the whole public opinion. They were changing the whole equation, the whole weather, at which all those little fights were created. And in the labor movement, it was really funny after the immigrant rights, the 2006 marches, they're like, who cares? What do we get out of this? They didn't calculate that there was a 32% increase in voter turnout the next election. Something that never could be replicated through structure in a lot of different places, okay? So momentum really is really, when we're talking about the tradition that teaches it, is talking about active popular support. And that's how they measure and think about victory. And those are two different conflicting theories of change.
Sorry.
Okay?
I don't know.
Let's get into it.
It's the NSA
I know.
trying to mess.
It's all because of your banks.
Yeah.
So just a quick example around that is that in Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, which is kind of an IF, a structured tradition, the whole point is to do a mass action, right? The theory of change really comes out that you got to get as many people in your organization so you have as much organizational power, and then you can try to get the target in one room or in a set of negotiations and pressure them for so you have as much leverage and they do what you want and whatever threats you put in. Does this make sense? Every organization is around that, and even the electoral programs that are trying to engage electoral work, at the end of the day, they're trying to get in the room with the public officials so they have more leverage. Is this making some sense? Good, okay, let's continue, one more. And this is really exemplified in Alinsky, right? That he says power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have, right? Very clear that power is really on this relationship that you have with your enemy. Now,
So in the momentum tradition, which is a lot of times people who, like the Serbians that teach a lot about momentum, and they teach the theory of change, they really use what's called the spectrum of allies, or we call it the spectrum of support. And what it means is they're measuring change based on changing public opinion. But this is different than sort of Clinton. So Clinton did this thing called triangulation, where he's trying to get a majority, okay? But what movements are trying to do is they're trying to polarize the public. And that means moving everyone towards your side, okay? Sometimes you polarize, and we're going to get into this, you polarize some of your opposition against you. But really, you're trying to get a critical mass of people to your side. You're trying to move everyone towards your movement. And when you get a critical mass of public support, you win. But it doesn't mean that you're moving people who are passive opponents don't instantly join your movement. No, you just move them to a place where they're neutralized. And if you can get enough people either in the active allies, meaning they're doing things, and you neutralize enough of your enemies and create passive support through voting and stuff, you win. And this theory of change has been studied and says that Francis Fox Pippin and a lot of theorists believe that this is measured in almost every single social movement in the United States of America, won by this form of polarization. Won through a process of getting a critical mass of active public support that changed the weather to win things, instead of just winning instrumental demands.
I'm just looking at I'm wondering, like, hostile neutrals, like, what does that mean? And is it only because it's friendly neutrals on the other side, or like what's an example of hostile neutral?
So the opposition would be the people who are actually part of the opposition or your cause. The active opponents are people who are giving the movement. They're like the base of the movement that's giving, voting, or participating in protests, or doing some sort of donations and persuasion. Moving them, we're trying to move them to passive opponents, meaning if you polled them, they would say, oh yeah, I'm anti-immigrant or whatever, but they don't actually do anything. And hostile neutrals is just another way of basically saying people who they're kind of in the confusion.
But they lean
place.
towards the opposition.
But they
a little
lean
bit. They're
towards
like,
the opposition. So if you poll
But you
them, they
know-
would do it, but they're not gonna vote. They're not gonna vote based on immigrant rights or whatever. And then neutrals would be people who, there's like, I don't really care, it's either way. And you can
Right.
apply that to the other side. So, in the women's suffrage movement, in the beginning, movements go through cycles. And when the women's rights movement and the women's suffrage movement started, it was very unpopular in the public. They had to go through a huge process of slowly polarizing the public and moving it towards their side. And when they started, there really wasn't that many people that were actively supporting the movement. There wasn't even that many people who even supported the movement. Most of the people that they had were passive supporters, and they had a lot of people that were sort of hostile against it but wouldn't necessarily vote against the women. And you see, in time, though, they polarized the public and they moved it. These are estimations, subjective estimation. You can measure this through polling, and we're going to talk a little bit more of that in the future. But in time, what happened is the women's suffrage movement got this active allies. They got so many people that if we talk about today, anybody who says, I don't believe in women should have the right to vote, they would not be able to run for public office because they'd be laughed out of office, right? It's considered now to be a base principle. Now, that's not saying that they didn't win everything, but they won some basic demands that they were fighting for. And nowadays, everyone's an active ally, because if you took something that was against women's suffrage, specifically that demand, I'm not talking about the feminist movement in general, but a huge portion of the American public would be actively against you. That's what I'm saying. And you can see this in a lot of things when people do things that, right now, if people were to advocate for, openly, for the idea of segregation the way it was in Jim Crow, or that people should be hanged, they're not going to get elected, right? However, they can do it under the table, they can do other things. But what movements do, and what women's suffrage do, is in time, Tom Hayden talks about this, is they get a critical mass, and then once the pillars fall and everyone accepts that basic demand, everyone sort of flips. Everyone flips. And you can kind of see that right now with marriage equality, okay? So the public opinion is drastically changing. And now they're winning in local places all over the place because politicians now are actually, it's in their self-interest to support that in certain areas. And that's not changed through instrumental stuff. That's changed because a movement changed public opinion all throughout the country. And then everything shifts. And then when you get to a point when everybody shifts, it's very hard then for anybody to advocate against the norm. And there's stages of doing that through the movement. So that's how popular movements work. They're really focused on how do we create polarization, how do we create the cultural shift around popular demands.
So I don't want to like derail this because I know you started off saying like there's not one or the other, but when you look at the marriage equality movement, I mean there were key moments of legal and public decision that actually helped, that has actually flipped. So you look at the repeal of DOMA last year, that is actually the reason why, I mean, yes, culture has, like, there is a cultural argument around how all of that has happened as well and how public momentum, but the flip of DOMA has now enabled all of these local sort of changes to happen as well. And
Totally.
so I don't know, so I know there's like, you have to do both in a way, and that's what we're getting to, but I just want, I don't know, I don't want to derail.
I think that's a really great observation.
Yeah.
So like in the immigrant rights movement, when I was in the labor movement, they only measure things based on instrumental demands.
Yeah.
And in the civil resistance movement, they measure things based on how it shifts public opinion. Now, sometimes winning instrumental demands
Yeah.
actually has big influences in moving public opinion. But those are different ways, different theories of change that are looking at the same phenomenon. Does that make sense? One is looking at it as its measurable instrumental impact, and one is looking about its symbolic, its ability to move the public opinion. And those are two different, when the labor movement, they're like, who cares about changing public opinion? When it came to the immigrant rights, in 2006, that was just crap, because do we get labor contracts? Do we build stronger organizations? And we're like, no. So, or maybe a little bit, but that's not because of anything we did through structure. So therefore, none of that actually exists. But a lot of times, creating certain instrumental campaigns, we call that symbolic demands, that are sometimes both instrumental and symbolic, allows us to win over the public. And that's what movements are more oriented to. So, civil resistance and the theories that we're talking about, we call it strategic escalation, is about thinking about measuring things in that way. So Erica Chenoweth is this really interesting academic who, she was actually not that progressive, and she, when civil resistance is the study of how movements overthrow dictators in a lot of other countries. And it was started by Gene Sharp, was one of the founders of that tradition, and he really believes that there's sort of a science, there's a sort of a whole field of studying how these movements work. They're not just flukes, and that there's really common phenomenon that you can really show you why certain movements win and other ones don't. And there was this huge database of thousands of different conflicts, military conflicts, that was put in this database with that military strategists use to calculate certain things about why certain guerrilla wars win and other ones don't, or certain conflicts. And she did this with all, like, literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of nonviolent movements across the globe. She created this huge database that measured how much participation there was, and things that were very similar. She was able to analyze it with data. And what she says is one of the common phenomenon is that all movements that win generally are able to maintain active public support with 3.5% of the population, around there, sometimes less, sometimes more, and whatever. But this reinforced a lot of other academics, like Francis Fox Pippin and other theorists, that believe that you need a critical mass of active public support to win a cause. And she basically gave the data to say she's actually got like a number, which in the United States would be around 12 million, 11 million people, that would continually protest and give votes or donations or participate in actions. If you can get that sustained support over time, plus you get a passive support from a majority of the public, you almost always win. That's her analysis. And you can overthrow dictators and stuff. And so now there's like, one of my friends is like thinking about getting a tattoo that says 3.5 on his, on his kazoo, on his shoulder. And he's like, focus on the 3.5, that's what we need, 11 million people, and then we'll win, instead of thinking about the target, instead of thinking about, all this other stuff.
Can I just ask a good, thank you, Bob. Yeah. Can I ask a quick question? What do you think about this 3.5 number?
People are doing GOTV math.
What do you say?
People are doing turnout math.
People doing turnout math in their heads right now? Yes.
I'm just like thinking back to Occupy and like sort of how like it ended up spreading into like all these like cities and like less so of the sense of like GOTV where people are like go out and like do your part and like vote, but like it was like these amount of people weren't just like gonna like do this one action, but believed in this thing enough to like be like open about it and acted and like sort of kept doing it, and it's almost, and it's like on the one hand you could like have you have to get like 11 million one-on-ones or like to show them. I can't do that. But like thinking about like the paradigm shifts that it would need to be able to like get that to happen, to get people to like get 11 million people to be like, oh, another world is possible, and we can we might be the group of people that do it.
Thank you. Let's get a couple more comments. Yes,
Um,
Daniel.
I think about like organizing more locally, so I wonder if these numbers would work. Like if all I wanna do is change something in, let's say, the city of Boston, if I got, whatever, 3.5% of, I think it's like 600,000, does it apply on a more local level?
Let's throw it out.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, to get 11 million, generally it's hard to do that, and I don't think there's a historical example when they've actually got that many, when they didn't get passive support from the majority.
Right.
So, that's why we teach people to think about it as a general process of polarization.
Yeah, just on that tip, like, I think the way that Erica describes it is like, you know, and this is kind of similar to organizing math that people are familiar with from a structure-based tradition, where, like, somebody, that's sustained active support, right? So how many people do you have that support you on some level to get to that figure, right? Like, you're almost always gonna have this majority, and I think in the pluralistic, well, I guess we haven't talked about that yet, but, you know, part of the theory of power here is that people can withdraw their participation or participate in new and different ways that come up the works in the systems. So if you have 3.5% who are really active in doing stuff, you have like a broad, people are coming from like all different places in society, and you can actually really affect like how power works because you have real diversity.
We're gonna continue because we're gonna discuss this more in our groups. But isn't that crazy? I don't know, when we met Erica, just thinking that if we get 3.5% or 11 million people to massively non-cooperate, then we can overthrow this government. It's kind of insane. So, I don't know, go ahead.
Just to clarify, because I've heard this before, but you said passive support from the majority, right?
Yes.
So that the shift does, okay, because it makes me think differently than what I did when I first heard one.
See, what Clinton in triangulation is trying to do is he's trying to get passive majority from just a majority of people. That doesn't win elections because people don't vote, or they're not gonna give you their vote. Their support is so lukewarm. You have to actually polarize the shit out of the public so that you have passive support from the majority, but you also have to get active support. Meaning that they'll give you their vote just on your cause. So they'll defect from politicians that don't believe in the movement.
Let's continue. Okay. So, the other piece that we wanted to talk about, well, we already kind of talked about that. Okay, well, it's kind of repetitive, but I think this is important, I think maybe to think about, well, there's a theory, but then there is what victory looks like. And I think for the structured tradition, it's really gradual change. I mean, you really start small, and this tradition really starts, as many of you know, by doing some very small local issue, like fixing the light post, working on trash issues, fixing a pothole. Really starts for us in the Dream Movement, really started with like, let's do college access, let's get the school to bring us in, let's take one deportation, very small, because the point is to build leadership and build more organization, right? But there is also an assumption that we cannot win larger issues unless we have enough organizational strength. Does that make some sense? Okay. So that's on the structured tradition. On the other side, on the momentum tradition, Francis Fox Piven has said, says major egalitarian reforms in American history did not come from gradual incremental reforms. Periods of egalitarian reforms came in rare intervals, moments of reform generated by disruptive protest movement. I mean, she's essentially saying the same thing that we're saying. There's this big moments of the whirlwind, not just one, but that movements that make these large changes, right? And in some ways, people in the momentum are kind of waiting for that moment that is going to be super duper climactic, that is going to be shit. Does that make sense? In structure, it's like, don't really care about that. It's not really about that. That's a flash in the pants. Really, it's about your organizational strength and for how long can you maintain your power. Because if you have power, then you can continue to do that consistently. Okay, let's go to number 3. There's 2 more. Go through this one.
So I think we went over this already, that to build the way you measure success also has to do with whether or not you can get concessions in the labor movement that give you contracts that allow you then to build a bigger organization to win more contracts or to win